In his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, All the Light We Cannot See, Anthony Doerr uses a literary technique that I was first formally introduced to in a college humanities course on world literature. That technique is called en media res, meaning in the middle of things or starting in the middle. In the first 10 pages of the book, so I'm not accused of spoiling anything, both of Doerr's main characters appear to die in an Allied bombing of the Nazi-occupied French town of St. Malo in the summer of 1944. Now, do they actually die? I won't spoil that for you entirely, but I will say that it was recently adapted into a miniseries, and I'm not sure Netflix makes specials where all the main characters die in the first 5 minutes of the show. Anyway, Doerr uses this en media res start to launch you into the narrative with far more dramatic force and narrative oomph than he would otherwise be able to, starting, for instance, with the childhood lives of those same characters. We've talked before about the odd structuring of the book of Hebrews. And today, we're doing some structural work, including some en media res, to kind of try to help us find the flow of our passage. First, we're going to pass over chapter 10, verses 1 through 18. Not because they're unimportant, but because they are largely a culminating summary of what we learned about the priesthood of Jesus in the previous 10 chapters of Hebrews. So since we've already taken 10 weeks talking about that together, we're going to focus more this morning on the turn that the second half of chapter 10 represents. See, it functions as a pivot for the rest of the book. Up until now, we've spent those first 10 chapters almost solely focused on the priesthood of Jesus and what that means for us. Now, we get a rhetorical turn from who God is in Jesus toward what that means for us and what God is calling us to as His people. So let's make the turn with the author this morning. Again, we're going to do some en media res, so while we'll be reading verses 19 to 29, we're going to start at 26. Would you read with me Hebrews 10:20, starting at 26? For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? For we know him of who said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay," and again the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Okay, maybe part of the reason that we're starting in the middle this morning is personal preference, because I'm a bad news first kind of person. And this passage, which clearly was the inspiration for the title of Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," has a serious warning for us here, mixed in with its exhortations and encouragements. In these 6 verses, our author focuses on warning his readers about what not to do in their Christian walk. And really, in a lot of ways, it boils down to don't give up. We're going to look at 2 specific ways that the author kind of pushes that message here in these verses. The first is in verses 28 and 29. We'll read it again. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, who has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has outraged the Spirit of grace? Okay, pulling back here. Our author is using a kind of if-then argument where he says, if judgment is harsh in this scenario, then what should we expect in this even worse situation? When the author talks about setting aside the law of Moses, he's referring to provisions in the Old Testament law that allowed for less harsh punishments for those who sinned unintentionally, accidentally, or out of ignorance. So setting aside the law means this is someone who has sinned, and in this case, here in the example, someone who has committed what we would call a capital offense, a sin that carries the possible penalty of death, and who did so intentionally, on purpose, with thought and meaning. This is somebody who has intentionally and purposefully walked away from God. This is important because it really sets the target for what our author is warning against this morning. The author is not, hear my not, he is not saying you got to watch out for judgment if you dare to have a doubt about what God's told you. If you relapse in that addiction, if you can't grow spiritually in that area, if you get hurt by other Christians and struggle to trust again, etc., etc. That's not what our author is targeting here. He's saying, don't walk away from faith in Jesus willingly of your own volition because of your sinful desires. His first don't give up here in the passage is, don't give up because there are consequences if you do. There is judgment that we believe in as Christians, and those consequences are grim. The second way he does it is kind of connected to that first. He says, don't give up because God isn't a teddy bear. Okay, those aren't his exact words, but I'm kind of paraphrasing this morning. Let's go back and look again at verses 30 and 31. He says, "For we know him," God, "who said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay.' And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." When I read that passage, I think about the first time that we're introduced to Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is C.S. Lewis's fictional version of Jesus. And the main characters are being introduced to Aslan by these talking animals. They're telling stories about him. He's the prince beyond the sea. He's the one who's coming to deliver them. Clearly the Jesus figure. And they say he's a lion. And the children say, "Whoa, a lion? Is he tame? Is he safe?" And the animals kind of look at them funny and they say, "Safe? Of course he's not safe, but he's good." Where we have a God who is not safe, but is good. And there are times where we really struggle with that concept. God is described here being a God who has vengeance against sin, who passes judgment, who is to be feared. And we can really struggle with that language, and in good me fashion. I think there are bad reasons and good reasons to struggle, and being very on brand, we're going to talk about the bad ones first. There's lots of different reasons. I just want to give one example in both categories. I think there is a bad reason to be uncomfortable with this vengeance, judgment language, and that is we like being our own gods. And we don't like the idea of a God who gets to correct us and is very willing to do so. That's a bad reason to not like this language. Because I'm not God, and you're not God. And it's really important for us to remember that for our own sake, to kind of keep ourselves in control and in the right direction mentally. I'm sorry if I'm popping your mental bubble this morning at all, but that's the truth. We aren't God. And it's really important for us to remember that. It's important for us as well for the picture that we paint for people who aren't Christians. St. Isaac of Syria once wrote, "For where humility blossoms, there God's glory bursts forth." We aren't God, and the humility to admit that is crucial for us as Christians. But there is a good reason to struggle with this kind of language being used for God. And that is that we are used to these terms being used in reference to people. We're used to these terms being used for other people. And all of these things, vengeance, judgment, fearfulness, these all tend to be terrible things to find in other human beings. These are not good things to find. Remember, as humans, we're made in the image of God, but we're also fallen. And so there are times where we take these things about God, but we image them, we reflect them in this sinful, fallen, broken way. When I think about vengeance in human beings, one of the stories that comes to my mind is about Richard Curtis. Richard is a British screenwriter. He writes movies. You may have seen some of his movie scripts, including Notting Hill and Love Actually. And the funny thing is, in the vast majority of Richard's screenplays, there is an idiot character named Bernard. And that is because decades before most of those movies were ever written or made, Richard Curtis saw Bernard Jenkins, who would later become a British Minister of Parliament, as a rival for the affections of a young woman, and she chose to pursue Bernard Jenkins instead of Richard Curtis. And so out of vengeance, for decades going forward, all of Richard's movies would include an idiot named Bernard. Vengeance, when it's exacted by us as human beings, tends to be petty, ugly, selfish, and any number of other negative adjectives. It's just not good. And we have to remember that our opinion of these things, these words, these ideas, is shaped by our sinful, broken human interpretations of the way God is described here. The reality is, we want a God who executes justice, who declares judgment. We want vengeance to be His. I mean, think about these questions. Do you want dictators who gas their own people to keep them in subjugation to avoid judgment? Do you want soldiers who use the horror of war as a cover to indulge their own sinfulness, to commit atrocities on the innocent and powerless among their foes to escape justice? Do you want child molesters and rapists to go unpunished? No, we all know deep down inside that there needs to be an ultimate source of judgment. We just don't want it to be directed at us. And that's where the hang-up comes. That's where we all have to remember we are not God and God is. That's the warning of our author here. He says that we all deserve to have that judgment directed toward us, but because of the mercy of Jesus, we have a choice. The people that he is writing to are not total outsiders to the gospel, to the message of the church. These are folks who have a deep and long-running connection to God's people. They know this message of mercy in Jesus, and he's saying, don't give up on that of your own volition. Don't let go of it. Because as our author is going to talk about in the other two sections this morning, there is hope for forgiveness and mercy in Jesus. Our guilty verdict that we deserve in the sight of a perfect God has been taken to the cross by Jesus, and we don't have to live in it anymore. We are given in the most unfair trade in human history the righteousness and goodness of God, of Jesus, and in exchange we only need to believe that Jesus was willing to take our sin, that he did, and that when he died on the cross he rose from the dead, but our sins stayed buried. And then to confess that he is God and not us. And the author says, don't give up on the hope of that trade. And in the other two sections, he gives us some good practical tools for how to do that. So let's shift our view over to verses 19 to 25. Therefore, brothers, Since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain that is through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Again, he starts by kind of wrapping up this idea of the priesthood of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus that we've walked through together over the rest of the book of Hebrews. But as he urges us to pursue God, he has various applications and instructions here in this part of the passage. And in some way, shape, or form, they all root back to this one shift in priorities that he lays out in the words of verse 25 when he says, the day that is drawing near. We're to focus our eyes because the day is drawing near. There are few things in life that affect us more than our viewpoint, the way that we look at the world around us. There are even non-Christians who get this. The leadership author Stephen Covey wrote, "We must look at the lens through which we see the world, for the lens itself shapes how we interpret the world." And the author of Hebrews here suggests to us a lens that we should look at the world around us through that focuses on the day to come, the day that is drawing near. Throughout the New Testament, that phrase is used as a euphemism primarily for two things: our death and Jesus' return. So it's this idea of death, yes, but also resurrection. When I see secular writers who see this point, who see this idea of our mortality and the importance of living through the lens of the day, of our mortality, I tend to see them doing so to lead toward a kind of Dionysian, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die kind of perspective. Life is short. Get out of it what you can. Get as much happiness as possible. But for the Christian, it's not eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, but rather, as Russell Moore once put it, eat, drink, and be merry, for yesterday we were dead. The Christian lens on life and mortality in a lot of ways is utterly backwards from how the world looks at it. We're not living life out of a fear of the end. We're living life out of a gratitude because we know that we wouldn't have true life if it wasn't for Jesus. And that means our today is totally transformed by the knowledge of what Jesus has done for us, and that our future is transformed by the knowledge that he is coming back, by his death and by his resurrection. I think what we believe about how Jesus is coming back and that Jesus is coming back has a ton of amazing implications for everything in our lives that we very often don't fully explore. Implications for our work, our hobbies, our relationships. But there's too much of this to talk about for now, so instead I'm going to give you a quick infomercial. We're going to have a church podcast episode on this particular topic, looking at kind of how does what we believe about Jesus' resurrection affect our lives today in the next week or two. So if you haven't subscribed to those yet, you can find them on the church website under resources and then podcasts. Okay, infomercial over. So we're supposed to be looking at our lives through a lens that is transformed by the knowledge of eternity. That's how we're supposed to be looking at things. And the question is, how do we keep our eyes on that? How do we stay focused? Our author gives us some interesting answers in verses 24 and 25. Let's read those one more time before we move on. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. How do we make it? How do we avoid falling away? How do we keep our eyes on the prize? We hold on to each other. We help each other in all those things. I've heard friends before kind of use this as the place to go off on the importance about Sunday morning church attendance, and that's not wrong. It's very true. I would also extend that to just spending time with other Christians during the course of the week in whatever setting that happens to work out for you, and making sure to encourage each other as Christians when we do it. But I want to kind of shift this morning and look at one thing real quickly, and that is that we have to be willing to actually show who we really are when we're spending time with each other in order for this to work out. We can't be hiding the hurt and the doubts and the fears that the world puts on us and that our deceptive hearts pull out of us when we're interacting with each other. Now don't hear what I'm not saying. We can't be a totally open book to every person we meet in life. I get that. I'm an introvert. I get that. But we have to find people with whom we can be open. Whether it's a small group, a volunteer team, or just somebody you click with during a conversation on a Sunday and you ask to go get lunch afterwards sometime, you need people to help hold on to you, to spur, as the passage says, to spur you on to love and good works, to encourage you. And you know what? They need you too. And they don't need the perfect you. They don't need the you that the world says this is how you should be and how you should think and how you should feel and how you should talk. And if you don't, then you are less. They don't need the person the world says you should be. They need who God made you to be, because He doesn't make mistakes. They need your quirks and your oddities, your weird sense of humor, your eccentricities and your interests. They need you. We need you. Please don't hold yourself back, the real you, back from the people of God just because the world says to cut it out. I heard a quote recently that said that the greatest gift that you can give to the people you love is the person God made you to be. Real quick note before we move on, this isn't some super affirming, just be whoever you want to be. God has given us who we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be growing in character, growing in Christ-likeness, so on and so forth. But all of us are doing that in our own unique way, with our own unique starting point and gifts and abilities and so on and so forth. And God made you that way for a reason. I have been in places in my life where who I was as a person was not welcome. I was expected to fit into a role and exhibit the characteristics that people expected from me. And it was two things. One, it was absolutely crushing for me as a person. But you know what? I think the second one I didn't figure out until way later, and it might have been even more important, and it was that it kept me from loving and serving well the same people who were putting those expectations on me. I really believe it was wrong of me. It was sinfully wrong of me, a sinful kind of people-pleasing, to fit myself into those boxes. Not primarily because of its effects on me, but because it kept me from loving the people around me well in the way that God made me to love other people. So friends, just please hear the story of my mistakes this morning and choose to love others in the church and others in your life enough to love them as the person God made you to be. Because as our author said, we're supposed to not neglect meeting together, spending time with the family of God. But if you're doing it with a mask on, you're not really spending time with them. Someone is, but it's not really you. So let's together choose to truly meet together regularly, to encourage each other and know each other, because that's how we avoid falling away. And that turns our corner into the last few verses of the passage this morning, verses 32 to 39. We've talked about what God wants us to avoid. We've talked about what God wants us to pursue. And now we're given a few exhortations about what that ends up looking like. Let's read verses 32 to 39. But recall the former days, when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. Two big takeaways here. The first one is the Bible gives us a clear idea of how our changed perspective as Christians should change our actions as well. I think we see that most clearly in verse 34 there. Let's read that again. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Do you see the structure that the author is using there? He gives us two changed behaviors and then kind of a motive or a reason for them. The first one, he says, you have compassion on those who are in prison. In the context of verses 32 and 33, this is probably talking about Christians who are jailed because of their faith. And he's saying instead of shrinking away and hiding and pulling back, you went and loved them. You cared for them. You took care of them. We know from records in church history that Christians would often voluntarily go to visit those in prison, even risking being put there themselves by being shown to be a Christian. He says you show compassion. You risk of yourself. And then second, he says you joyfully accept the plundering of your property. We have to remember this morning, joy doesn't mean I'm so happy and nothing in life is ever sad. That's not joy. Joy means peace in the midst of turmoil. Joy means an ability to see beauty on the other side of brokenness. Joy means that there is a positive emotion, a contentment that our circumstances cannot touch. The early church that Paul is talking about here did what our author is going to talk about, what Jesus did in verse 12, where it says he endured hardship because the reward was infinitely greater. And that's where we get to our motive. He says the early Christians were able to behave in this uniquely selfless way, both in regard to risking on behalf of others and to accepting evil that is done to them, because they had this changed perspective, because they were able to look off and say, I know that I have a better possession than any earthly thing, and that it is an abiding possession. That Jesus is never going to walk out on us. He isn't going to give up on us. That you cannot become unlovable in His eyes. There is no such thing as lost enough to be unredeemable in His mercy and grace. And the author says, if God won't give up on us, don't give up on God. Don't walk away. Hold steady. Hold fast. The author is clear. Life is a marathon. There will be particularly hard moments, but there will also be times where life is a totality. The just weariness and burden is going to be hard. And even in those hardships, he wants us to know that there is blessing still. As Christians, when we face hardships, we believe that those can actually be a blessing for others in our community. The early church father Tertullian wrote that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. He was saying that by living in a way that makes our different priorities, our different purpose clear, even in the midst of the hardest things in life, we can be a light to the lost around us. So hardship can actually be a blessing to the people around us as it allows us opportunities to share who Jesus is and what He's done for us. But the Bible also teaches us that there are blessings for us as Christians and for us as Christians together, for us as the church, when hard times come. A lot of you probably know that we got stuck in California for an extra week. We were supposed to be back here last Thursday. We didn't get in until Friday morning. And a big part of that was that there was a blizzard where we were staying. And when you think blizzard, you think snow. Well, apparently up there you also think wind, and we had 110 plus mile an hour winds whipping down out of the mountains and lost numerous trees all over the community. My in-laws lost at least 4 40-ish foot trees in the front yard. So the The firewood ministry, I got a lot more chainsaw experience now after this week. Lots and lots of chainsawing. And that, I think, is actually going to be one of the things I remember the most, was the chorus of chainsaws all over that community for the next 2 or 3 days as people got out and freed themselves, but then got out and started freeing everybody else up and getting all throughout the community and spreading out and clearing out each other's spaces. And it reminded me of this way that I really think God has designed us as communities to come together during times of hardship and tragedy. I think that's a big part of why it says here, sending this letter to a community that is going through persecution and going through hardship, that the author says, don't forsake gathering together. He says, don't give it up. Even if that means risk, even if that means more hardship, don't give up on it, because God blesses us in the way He can pull us together in the midst of hard times. So if God will bless us in these times of hardship, the application of our author is, fix your eyes on eternity, live in its light, and hold on to each other while you do it.